Welcome to the Ideas Hour with your hosts David Cameron and Suzanne Zeedyk, exploring big ideas that matter. This series was originally broadcast on Teacher Hug Radio in 2021 and 2022. It is still available in their archive as well as in this format.
I do know that I'm Mr. Enthusiasm about all of the Ideas Hours programmes. I think my most commonly used phrase at the moment is brilliant. But that's because we pick people that we want to talk to. And then we think about who else might want to listen to them. And today is a superb case in point. Suzanne will do the big introduction to today's guest in just a minute. But I can barely stop myself because today we're talking about much more than an idea or ideas. We're talking about a campaign. And that's what really excites me. The ideas that become actions, that challenge the status quo, that actually get down and dirty with reality and try to make a genuine difference.
And today's conversation fills me with hope because it envisions a country with an education system that's explicitly constructed to meet children's developmental needs. Listeners may know that I'm a developmental psychologist, and I'm constantly aware of the ways in which our ordinary, normal systems and practices often don't give children what they need. Sue Palmer has been thinking hard about how we could do that. She's a former primary head teacher. She's head of the Upstart Campaign here in Scotland, and she is author of several books, including the well-known Toxic Childhood. And with her work in Upstart, she thinks that instead of starting children in formal education at the age of 4, which is our current cultural practice, she wants children to experience a kindergarten stage up until the age of 7. And her argument is firmly based in developmental science. But the resistance that the campaign has faced suggests that it's maybe even a bigger idea than Sue first thought. So welcome, Sue, to talk about these big ideas. It's a delight to have you here.
Thank you very much for asking.
Okay, so let's just dive in. Tell us about your big ideas, Sue. Tell us what the Upstart campaign is and why you thought we needed it.
Well, we think we generally describe it as a rights-focused, relationship-centered, play-based kindergarten stage for children between 3 and 7. And then we usually tag on as often as possible outdoors in nature. And sometimes when people are still looking sort of dazed, we say, like in the Nordic countries, which it's basically recognition of the developmental science since basically Froebel in the 1830s, recognizing that children flourish most, young children flourish best when they're playing outdoors with their friends, when they're social and active, and when the people caring for them are non-judgmental, are supportive, and are, well, Suzanne, you talk about a circle of security. You did so in the chapter you wrote for Upstart's book. And it's that business of children knowing that there are grown-ups around to whom they can return if they need to feel secure again, but so that they can go out, they can explore, they can discover, they can learn, they can experiment, they can take little risks, which is what play is all about, and then come back to the safety of these grown-ups. And I would maintain, having sort of read lots of books on evolutionary biology and stuff, that this is basically being what lucky children have had up to the age of about 7 throughout history, in every time and every culture until our own. And it's really only been since the latter part of the 20th century that most kids were not out playing from an early age and didn't have this supportive community of mums and grannies and aunties. Usually it was usually the women that were around that they had as the safe haven they could go back to. It's life for children has changed enormously. And that was why when we started thinking, it came out of a discussion for one of David's organised events once on resilience. And a group of people just thought, we need something to help make sure that children get that opportunity of having a childhood for their mental health. So that's where the idea originally came from. And we launched officially in 2016 and have been slogging our hearts out ever since.
Well, let's give you a chance to amplify all of that, Sue, because I'm going to ask the very obvious question, which is why this idea matters so much right now.
Well, particularly right now after COVID, we've noticed, I mean, a lot of people have noticed the effects of children being isolated, not being able to go out with their friends. We're spotting it very clearly. But I would say it's been becoming more and more important really since the beginning of the 20th century, because, you know, children can't go out to play. Even older ones are very often closeted indoors for much of their time. So we cannot expect them to be getting those opportunities, particularly at that early age when, you know, brains and bodies are forming for active social outdoor play. We've got to make sure we provide it on the state. But as you mentioned earlier, we have this very early school starting age in the UK, ridiculously early, in fact, if you look at the rest of the world. And we've therefore sort of got used to the idea that they should be in school from 4 or 5 and getting on with the 3 Rs. Well, there is absolutely no research-based reason why that should be seen to be the right age to start. In fact, all the indications are that it's probably better to leave them till a little later before you start on formal schoolwork. And it's certainly important for them to be getting this relationship-centered, play-based experience in early childhood, because that's how they build all the natural biological skills and capacities on which the formal learning can be based.
Sue, can I come in there and just play devil's advocate?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let me just frame it that way. Okay, so Sue Palmer, you're telling me that we have an education system that is not based in children's needs? How could that come about? How is that possible? Because for many people, that's just like a strange idea. How could that be? So tell us how that could have come about.
Well, it came about due to parliamentary debates in the 1860s in the Westminster Parliament, where they were debating when to start state-provided education, which was happening all over Europe. And most countries that had got going already were choosing 6 or 7 as the starting age. But it was decided to start the year children turned 5, not for educational reasons, but for what were put forward as child protection reasons, because there were an awful lot of children. They wanted the mums in the factories, earning money for the Industrial Revolution and everything. And there were a lot of children out on the streets. So it was seen as an opportunity to get the children safely off the streets. And also, and this was noted in the debate, the sooner they went into school, the sooner you could get them out the other end, and they could go into the factories too. This was an economic decision taken by politicians in the late 1860s. So England began its system in 1870, and I think Scotland was 72. Like many other parts of the British Empire, chose the same starting date of the year children turn 5. In fact, I would say almost all the countries that start school that early are ex-members of the British Empire for that reason.
I think it's really interesting. Lots of the things that you're saying just now, Sue, and one of them is about when we had a concept of childhood. Because in a sense, during the Industrial Revolution, particularly and prior to that, there wasn't the same sense of there being a childhood. And what we appear to have done is established that possibility of children having something that was a childhood. They weren't dragged into the factories. They weren't involved in supporting the agricultural economy or whatever. And then we undermine it immediately by creating a formal context for whatever reason that children are involved in. I mean, is that an observation that makes sense to you?
Yeah, I'm with Neil Postman on the concept of childhood. I think it's probably related to the development of literacy and Yeah, people weren't seeing childhood as anything particularly special, but at the same time, we don't. I don't think we do. We just take it for granted that things will happen. It's only now that we've got developmental scientists like Suzanne that we're beginning to recognize that these things happen because of the circumstances which they occur in. Probably throughout history, if you think about it, up to about 7, most kids would not be capable of working. So at 7, you could get them to go and look after the beasts or do something else helpful for the family. But until then, they'd just be with the other kids. They'd just be out messing about, possibly, falling in rivers and things, but being pulled out, playing. And that's how we have evolved our capacity for things like adaptability, creativity, curiosity, resilience, self-regulation. All these skills which develop in early childhood have happened because kids under 7 can work. Once we'd got a literate population and children couldn't actually, what Postman claims is children couldn't access literacy till they were 7 or 8. So we got this precious garden idea. But in fact, that precious garden idea wasn't precious. It was just the way things were. And of course, as Postman has explained, and once you've got an electronic communication system, which all children can access from very early childhood, the concept of childhood gets lost again.
This is very timely for us, Sue, because we did a very exciting conversation with Richard Gerver, which was rooted in the work of Ken Robinson. And one of Ken Robinson's great quotes is about the most important thing about a child in the current schooling system being the date of manufacture. And there's something really interesting, I think, about this idea that we've got of pace in education. It's built into Curriculum for Excellence. It's built into the concepts of progression in English schooling as well, that, we need to be hitting targets which are plucked from somewhere or other. And one of the things that I've been talking about a lot recently is the idea that for some children, they need to spend longer taxiing along the runway to guarantee the kind of lift off that we need. And yet we've got caught up in this peculiar concept of development as being somehow uniform, and that all children should match that pattern of development regardless background. So I think there's an interesting overlap between lots of the discussion that Ken Robinson's had around schooling and his idea of it killing creativity, and lots of the thinking that you're doing. And again, just putting that back to you, is that a fair comparison to make?
Indeed, as a former teacher, and my subject was literacy. I only got into this child development stuff when I researched toxic childhood, which was 20 years ago now. So it's most of my life, it was literacy. And I have to admit that as a teacher, I found having some sort of benchmark for what you expected a particular age group of children to be able to do was quite important, because otherwise it's very easy just to let things slide. You need to know, well, usually round about the age of 8, they can start decoding books and doing things and so on. But everything that I've learned about child development suggests that up until the age of about 7 or 8, you should not be thinking in terms of age-related standards of expectation. What we've done with curricula, particularly in England, I would say, and particularly since the beginning of this century, because of the access to data and because of the sort of accountability and measurement obsession within government, the testing of children and the expectations that children should be making constant progress has become greater and greater and greater. And I think one of the reasons that I'm so fortunate to be living in Scotland, well, I actually trained as a teacher in Scotland, but I'm back home again, is that here we haven't bought into that idea anywhere near as badly as the English did. So that we have got a a sort of more of a chance of giving our children a bit of a childhood, which is actually a biological necessity, before we start them on the treadmill.
So can we, just to have people to have a big picture, if I just summarize what we've just said so far, you've said we have developmental science that tells us what children need. So we didn't used to know that. So now we know more about what children need. And we can see that the context in which children are growing up has changed. So there's a much more electronic environment now. And that's different from when evolutionarily we lived in small villages on the plain. Okay, and if that matters for their development, that makes sense too. And we know that most of the world starts formal schooling at the age of 6 or 7. So we know we're a bit out of sync with that. Okay, so all of that at one level seems pretty straightforward. Okay, let's do it.
Yeah.
Tell us, why do you think we don't do this? Where does the resistance come from? Help people to understand why this idea is uncomfortable and a big idea rather than a obvious. Why isn't it done? Why do we still need you? Why is there still a campaign?
We concluded, I remember saying after the first meeting, oh, well, we should sort it within about 3 years. And they've regularly thrown that back at me now because we had totally underestimated the significance of cultural assumptions, cultural attachments. And I think, and I mean, you'd be better on this than me, Suzanne, I think a sort of fear in people of actually recognizing the realities of child development and the needs of children in those early stages, because it's so difficult to sort of think, how can we provide it? Which is why we looked at how can we help universal services provide it. I think there is some fear about accepting that early childhood experiences are so important. But I think there's also a conviction nowadays, I don't know where that comes from, that everybody's got to be told how to do things. You teach everything.
So that's the idea of the difference between the carpenter and the gardener.
And indeed,
that we have to manufacture childhood and we have to teach children everything. So we have to be carpenters. Adults are responsible for all of that, and that development won't just flow and happen naturally. If you create an environment, children will bloom. That instead, that we're responsible for it. So you really think a lot of the resistance is based in fear, Sue?
I think it's fear. I think politically, it's because political decisions, are usually short term, and the advantages of doing something like this and disrupting the system to do it will not be seen for some time. I think there's a lot of different things that all come together. But yeah, the gardener and the carpenter analogy is very much, I think, part of it now. That we can't believe that, oh gosh, maybe we aren't as necessary as we thought we were. How could it be that children, 3 to 7-year-olds together could actually be teaching each other? That frightens people. They want to be important grown-ups.
But it's more ideological than that, isn't it? I mean, essentially, we're dealing with a culture of control when we get into this discussion. And there is a much wider reluctance around children's rights, and we've seen lots of conflict around the UNCRC, all of that kind of discussion. I don't think I got that acronym quite right, but we'll let that slip for the moment. That if we're in control of what we give children, if we're passing on the best that's thought and taught, it's building conservatism, both as an ideology and a philosophy, as well as a way of thinking about education built into what we do with children. So it becomes about replication rather than education.
I'd agree with that too, but I think there's another angle, and that is that if you're not educating children up to the age of 7, if it's not seen as sort of formal education, then you have to see it as care. And I'm afraid I'll then get into the feminist angle on it. Care has always been women's work. It's unpaid, it's unvalued, it's unsung, it's unimportant. Nobody actually knows quite what it is because it's never been a university subject that we could define. So there's that angle as well, that it's something that is simply not valued within a patriarchal society.
And I sometimes think, what would have happened if we'd put those early years into a different system? Right. So it makes sense. It's understandable why they went into the education system, because we've got a system that's based on children getting older and you do it in groups. And it makes sense that you would put early years into an education system. But what would have happened if we put early years into the health system? So as soon as it went into the education system, we start framing those early years in more formal academic ways. And once it becomes normative within a culture, it's hard to shift that, not only for the people in the system, but for the parents of those children too.
Indeed. And in Finland, where they didn't start formal education till 7, and over the period from about 1970s, I think, they've developed their daycare system, and it's called daycare. And it's not been seen as education. It's been seen as care, but it has been highly professionalized. And yes, indeed, the people within there call themselves pedagogues, but it's a very different thing from school teaching. They've created a system which is much more to do with children's holistic development and well-being in those years. There's an increasing push down, even in Finland now, towards, a bit more sort of preparation, readiness like stuff when the kids are 6. But otherwise, it's really seen as the nurturing of children and the nurturing, the provision of opportunities for play, rather than as seen as an education context. Yeah.
And I think this is something we really need to be very careful about, because I think one of the tensions, if we go back to some of the great New Labour debates, was about whether we were making provision to enable the economy or to develop the child. And I think the risk is that if we put things into the category of care and health and take them away from education, we may risk losing that concept of child development and think of this much more about somewhere we put kids so that adults can get on with something economically more productive. I mean, is that a reasonable contrary view?
Wait, can I come in there? David, I disagree with you. I think the fact that we put them into the education system, although it sounds like we're thinking about children's development, I don't think we are, because we're talking about early years. And if early years development is based in care and nurture, the education system in terms of academics and formalities doesn't pay attention to that. So you can make easily a counter argument that says it was putting it in the education system that took away from meeting their developmental needs. So isn't it interesting that we don't have a system that meets those needs?
Well, what we don't have is a shared view of what constitutes education.
Or childhood.
But if you bear with me a moment, Suzanne, one of the things that I would like to open up later on in the conversation with Sue is this idea that those elements of nurture and care should be as much part of the education of children who are out with what you're defining as early years and might be out with what you're defining as childhood. And that these are essential elements in the way that we think about education. Education's not about the delivery of a curriculum. It's about the growth of young people supported. And one of the interesting things for me is that, I've always thought about early years as being the place where we open up opportunities through play, through structured experiences, for children to find out what they can do and for us to observe that. And then we build forward the next experiences that we offer to them on the basis of what we see and what we learn. And what we've got into, I think, and we'll come back to this with Sue, I think, very strongly, is that the problem with our education system is that it's too often built backwards from endpoints rather than forwards from developmental starting points. And that seems to me that, it seems to me that what we need to do is we need to agree that education is about nurture, it is about care, it is about support, and it's not something which should be characterized by dramatic cliff edge changes as children move from one apparent stage of development to another. So,
this is one of the other arguments I've come across while arguing for a kindergarten stage. And I would totally agree with you, David. And as a Scottish trained teacher, I saw a duty of care as one of the most important parts of my job. I also saw playful learning as being something that was much more productive than sitting them down and drilling them. I was very much, once I'd learned about taking them outdoors and how much better it was if you were outdoors, I was very much in the outdoors with the kids. So I'm not saying that I don't think that these things are important throughout the education process, but increasingly in the 21st century, there has been this top-down pressure to, get started on telling them things and doing things to them. And when we set up Upstart, we'd seen the way that in both Wales and England, movements towards a bottom-up approach. The foundation phase in Wales, the early years foundation stage in England, had gone beautifully. People were very excited, but the press down constantly of literacy and numeracy people, the obsession with examinations. I mean, I think the foundation phase in Wales was somewhat, a large extent, stymied once they stuck back the SAT in primary year 2, year 3. Which year was it anyway, at the end of Key Stage 1. And what's happening in England at the moment with the sort of Go of Knowledge curriculum being pushed down into early years is quite terrifying. So when we started Upstart, we thought, no, we're not going to be constantly fighting on the back foot as they are when it gets going like that. We're going to look to the bright sunlit uplands. We're going to say, let's have a kindergarten stage. Let's see that as a complete thing. And then you get your basis in and you can build your education, hopefully relationship centered and pretty playful on top of that. But otherwise, as you say, it's that constant pressure downwards, the top-down pressure, which is so related now to control.
Yeah, and I think we'll come back to lots of this. I mean, one of the things that I said a great deal is that in early years at its best, we're planning forward from the child. And then we reach a point where we're planning backwards from the assessment. And I think what you're doing is really highlighting that. And the other thing, Sue, I'm very grateful to you for doing is contextualizing lots of this in across the UK, because one of the things we would have asked about is what this means and where are we at in terms of England. But I think this is a good time, Suzanne, to kind of broaden out this discussion and also to try and tie it in to some of Sue's other work.
I agree, David. Sue, a lot of your insights that you're sharing with people at the moment go back to your book, Toxic Childhood, which I mentioned in your introduction. So can you tell people how it informed the Upstart campaign? Because there will be people who don't know about it.
Well, this is when I have to admit my dreadful past. In the 1990s, I was a literacy specialist, and I was working for the English government on something called the National Literacy Strategy. I wrote quite a few of their training courses, including the one on grammar. And I was very, very keen on going around talking to teachers in England. I talked to thousands and thousands of teachers every year on how to teach writing. But as the 90s went on, it was the end of the 90s that I was doing this. And as moving into the new century, increasingly, I was hearing from the teachers that I was meeting that they were concerned about the children, that over recent years, they'd noticed small changes in them. The most commonly said things were things like, they can't seem to focus their attention as well as they used to. They find it more difficult to focus. There's more low-level behavioral issues than there used to be. Or they're not getting along as well with each other in the playground. And the one that really concerned me, that actually sent me off on the mission, was their language is going down year on year. And I'd heard this from so many people that I actually started thinking, well, maybe there is something going on that we're not conscious of. And that was how, originally starting with, I really started hanging out with speech and language therapists big time in the end of the 90s, and learned an enormous amount about early language development and what sort of thing was going wrong, because we did find that in the disadvantaged areas of the country, there was a huge decrease in children's language capacity at school. So I basically identified 10 areas of childhood which I could see that there had been significant changes in. And it took over the whole book took from beginning to end, took 8 years to research, because I was identifying experts in every one of these areas: nutrition, activity levels, because I didn't actually even think of the word play to start with. I was thinking about them not getting out and moving as much. Sleep, family structures, childcare structures, all sorts of things. So I'd find experts on this, interview them. They'd send me off to read things and send me to more experts to interview. And eventually I would hack each of these into a chapter, send it back to experts to read, to check the science. And the book was then called Toxic Childhood: How the Modern World is Damaging Our Children and What We Can Do About It. Because basically it was all these changes in lifestyles seemed to a lot of experts to be impacting on the way children were developing.
So Sue, can I come in there just to underline that? So you are saying that the way we live in a society changes children biologically and changes things like their ability to talk, their ability to pay attention, their ability to make friends. Is that right?
Well, I didn't know the word epigenetics at the time. I'm not sure it had even been invented. And it seemed to me, I don't know enough about that basis of science, because that's been since I did the research. But it was to do with things like parents from a very, very early age spending less time talking to and singing with their children, because there were so many distractions that kept both the child and the parents away from each other. And then people pointed out most parents are working now, so they're not actually at home as much with their children. And when they are, everybody's tired and there aren't the same opportunities. So there were all sorts of things like that that just seemed to me that things weren't happening that had happened in the past, and that somehow we had to try and find a way to ensure that they could happen within contemporary society.
And one of the reasons that getting that idea that the way that you live, the world a child enters, shapes them biologically, right? That's a strong idea.
And culturally.
That culture shapes biology, to put it that way.
Yeah.
If you bring that right up to date, that means that if enough children have had altered experiences by COVID, that the way we have been living during COVID will have changed these cohorts of children. And that becomes a really striking idea.
Well, yeah, there's a piece in the New York Times today about it. It's an idea that I think maybe we all ought to get our heads around, and that. But I mean, I certainly believe in the sort of plasticity of the brain, and that if we provide the sort of supportive environment that will help children retrieve. I mean, obviously, you want to make sure that you get it right as early as possible, so that you've got so much protective factors, preventative factors in terms of helping them develop resilience. But I still believe that if we keep on trying throughout childhood, it doesn't have to be fatalistic.
And I find this a really encouraging conversation for all sorts of reasons. I love how holistic the conversation is. You know, we've talked about technology, we've talked about changes in society, we've talked about ideology, we've talked about politics, and we've talked about practice. And all of these elements and more have come in. And I think this is hugely important. And for me, Sue, you've captured a lot of this, not in the book you wrote, but in the book that you edited, which is Play is the Way. And tell us a bit about that. Tell us a bit about your choice of title and the huge range covered by the book.
It's the most wonderful little book. You can't imagine how delightful it was editing that book. The opportunity to commission it, I have to thank Carol Craig of Postcards from Scotland for saying that I could. And then to think, right, we'll need a chapter on public health. Who can I get to write that? We'll need a chapter on children's rights. Who can I get to write that? So I trying to look at early childhood, 3 to 7, from lots and lots of different angles, and the reason why we do need this relationship-centered, play-based approach. And of course, the first chapter, I had to choose Suzanne Zeedyk.
Never heard of her.
No,
Never heard of her.
Weird name.
And that was the first one that came in, actually. And then the second one that came in, Marguerite Hunter-Blair, who's the chair of Play Scotland, doing Play. And it just knitted on top so wonderfully. And then another one comes in from Pam Jarvis on why we can't accelerate early learning. You know, we've got to give time for the brain to mature. That was beautiful. And then the next one comes in from Kathy from McCulloch from Children's Parliament on children's rights. And they're all, and I'm just going, oh my goodness me, oh, this is absolutely wonderful. I'm so proud of that book. And I think everybody in Upstart's very proud of it. It's sold enormous numbers. It's not been published yet for a full year. And for a little book on early years practice from a small publisher to have sold 3,500 books in that period of time is really just, it's not normal. So it's been really well received, and we're very proud of it. But it is very much trying to show that this is about childhood from many, many angles. It is not just an educational concern. And that's why I don't think we really want to be in the education sector. We really need an early years sector that is actually concerned with, you know, the early child development, because that's what a country is built on.
I think it's interesting, though, to just look back. We had Tim Brighouse and Mick Waters on in their previous series of The Ideas Hour. And both Mick and Tim have nailed their colours to the mast on the idea that, in quoting Mick, that curriculum is the total experience that we offer to the child. So you're getting a definition which applied to early years, to primary and to secondary education, where we needed to think about curriculum in a much more holistic way and think about it around experiences. And then you think about the early work that Tim Brighouse did as Chief Education Officer in Birmingham, where he had the guarantee. One of the really influential ideas from his early work was that idea of the guarantee. And that spoke about offering the richness of experience to all young people. So there's something, I think, really important that we open up this discussion about the challenge to what we conceive of as an education sector, rather than change that discussion into how we go further. So, you know, I think some big ideas in there, Sue.
I don't know. I think I do beg to differ a bit. I totally admire Tim Brighouse's work and Mick Waters and yours. But you're all men, and I know this sounds a bit pettish of me, but I still get back to that, all those women for millennia after millennia who were caring for children and knew stuff about caring for children that we don't know about because we never wrote it down and it never became the subject of university study. I remember I once interviewed Simon Baron-Cohen for a book, and the psychologist in Cambridge, who's very interested in the difference between empathy and empathizing and systemizing. And he said to me, you know, I have been checking out all the subjects taught in Cambridge, and with the possible exception of English literature, none of them have any empathizing in them.
Wow.
And I just thought, yeah, that's what education is about, systems. It's about understanding how things and systems work. And we have never valued all that other stuff that human beings did, which was to do with connection and to do with the holistic approach to life. We carefully created lots of super systems. Now, I'm not knocking the systems; they're really helpful, and but they are something different from care.
Sue, you're making me think about Ian McGilchrist's work, and David, we're hoping that Ian McGilchrist would be a future guest on the Ideas Hours. What Ian McGilchrist is trying to say is that we need that holistic approach. And he's tried to help us to understand how the brain makes sense of systems as, I'm not quite sure doing systems versus care is how he would describe it. But he's tried to help us to think about how our brain makes sense of and categorizes the world. Because if this is embedded in ways that you see the world, that does make this a really deeper and bigger and slightly more complicated conversation. Because if education is about systems and we're missing fundamental care, well, how do you address that? Now, David, you would disagree with that, some of that, I think, because I'm stumbling through that sentence. Because you think education is about care. So do you think we've done that?
You and I
know that's your message. Do you think we've done that well enough? Or
was care as a strategy for
what do you
raising
think,
attainment?
David?
And one of the things that I've been committed to, and I absolutely take Sue's point, that we have lived in a patriarchy, and lots of the patriarchal qualities are reflected in everything that we do. I would argue they're reflected in health as well. I would argue that we have the same structural issues around health. I'm not arguing to be the next Prince Charles and championing homeopathy or whatever, but we have the same structures in health, we have the same structures in the legal system. And Ian McGilchrist's work identifies how we've allowed dominant in what we do. We've become obsessed with efficiency, with numbers, and with the idea of progress and control. We've seen accountability as a key mechanism for moving things forward, and all of these things have become embedded in the way we think about learning. I guess my problem, I think, is that whereas you and Sue in this discussion are trying to take early years, if you like, away from that system, I'm taking a different view, which is let's fight on every battleground. I know it's pretty poor form to move from my rhetoric of care and empathy to the idea of battlegrounds, but I think there is a battle. And I'm not prepared to abandon the battleground of education to those who are obsessed with accountability and rigidity and what I talked about earlier as replication rather than education. Education is the supported development of the child and young person. That's, if you like, the etymological root of the term, and I'm not prepared to let that go. And I don't want to bang on about it, but that's why I was absolutely delighted when I was asked to lead the working group in Scotland that led to the production of a report on the outdoors, and it was outdoors connection. It was the two themes that have run profoundly through much of what you've had to say in this programme, Sue, about the importance of connection and the importance of experience and the outdoors all coming together. So, you know, I think we're in danger of manufacturing a disagreement from differences of approach rather than differences of opinion.
I don't think it is a disagreement. I think it's to do with taking it from the very beginning, right? So a baby's born, and you wouldn't be thinking of school at all when a baby's born. What you're thinking about is care. And there's a stage when, and it's around about 7 or 8, you know, the UNCRC defines early childhood as birth to 8. And that seems to be the point at which we can assume that all things having gone okay, the child can self-regulate, can concentrate, is ready to sit down and begin to learn in a more formal way. So that very early stage is sort of pre what you could call formal schooling. And I think we've got to be really, really careful that we don't confuse school with education. I agree with you about that, but I think we've also got to value stuff that is not at all educational, stuff that is just care and connection, which comes first. And the education then grows out of the top of that. We're creating what the UN, I think it's UNICEF, calls, we're aiming at the holistic development of a child's social, emotional, cognitive, and physical needs in order to build a broad and solid foundation for lifelong learning and well-being. Gosh, I've put it up on a PowerPoint slide so often I can recite it. But it's that's what early childhood care and education is about. And then education grows out of it.
So Sue, let me come in there because we're heading very rapidly to the end of our hour. And from going from these wonderful big themes that we've been unpacking here, can I get you to bring us right back down to the classroom and ask the final question that we always ask? What would you like teachers in classrooms practically to do with your ideas?
With a supplementary, if I may, to both of you, because I think we'd be really good if we could broaden that out and say, what should those of us who don't work in early years take from this conversation? Because I think we desperately need that sense of continuity and development. And we need to address education, if you like, as a philosophy. And I think we need to see development and continuity through that. So what does it mean for teachers, and what does it mean, as far as possible, for all of us involved in teaching?
Well, until round about the year 2000, I was, as a teacher, completely ignorant about early years. I did not know the first thing. I understood a bit about it. I'd had a baby, I'd done all that stuff. I'd worked with children with additional needs, so I knew that there were developmental things that I didn't really quite understand. But once I started doing the research, once I found it out and I started hanging out with early years people, I suddenly realized there's a whole world here that I didn't know anything about. And I'm really going to have to try and gen myself up on it, because basically, if I don't understand it, I'm building my teaching on very, very, very shaky ground. So what I would like people to take out of it is, please, well, you could read Play is the Way. That's not a bad book on the subject, but you know, find some reading, but also listen to some early years people. Listen to what they can tell you, because they know stuff that we teachers don't. And please, if you're in, you know, the hierarchies, when you're doing an educational committee, get an early years person on there. They don't get asked. their voice is not being heard. They are incredibly important in terms of, the material that we teachers get to work with, and they know stuff. And that's what I've learned in the last 20 years.
That's a brilliant ending for this hour, Sue.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. But what I really hope that's done is that's opened up a wide debate about what education means, how it interacts with care, and where one thing begins and another ends. I would love it, Sue, if I was as adept at quoting my own slides as you are, but I often quote the 1947 report on Scottish education, which talks about how schools should be judged. And what it says is not by exam results, but by how far it enables the full flowering in due course of all that is best. And we should try and find that quote and build it into another program. But I think that's the bridge between all of the different elements of today's discussion.
Can I end with another quote that's lying on my desk at the moment? It's internet wisdom, and it goes, "Childhood is not a race to see how quickly a child can read, write, and count. Childhood is a small window of time to learn and develop at the pace which is right for each individual child." And that, to me, is what I want to see up to about 7.
And what I love is that we take a period of life in which we often think is sweet, and we have turned it into really big, radical discussion today that points to the bigness of the early years.
One of the points that you're both making, is that we compartmentalize far too much. We don't think broadly enough. We don't think holistically enough, which is why I didn't think today's discussion was all over the place, because we kept coming back to the same, essentially big philosophical questions.
Hooray!
Thank you for being with us, Sue, so much.
Brilliant.
If you would like to know more about Sue Palmer's work, you can check out any of the books we've discussed. Her edited collection, Play is the Way, was published in 2020 by the Center for Confidence Press. Her seminal book, Toxic Childhood, keeps getting republished, and we haven't even mentioned her many other titles, including Detoxing Childhood, 21st Century Boys, and 21st Century Girls. Sue now leads the national campaign for a kindergarten stage in Scottish education called Upstart, and you can find out tons about that on their website, which is www.upstart.scot. And we are pleased to have had this opportunity to bring her insights to a wider audience.
This has been the Ideas Hour, brought to you by Suzanne Zeedyk and the real David Cameron.